9:47 at night on a Tuesday in Midtown Manhattan, and Raymond Falcone was about to burn down an empire he'd spent 18 years rebuilding. The 47th floor of Falcone Tower was silent, except for the hum of the city bleeding through triple-paned glass, and Raymond stood alone at a mahogany desk that had once belonged to his father, a man who'd been shot in this very room when Raymond was 19. He was 37 now, 6'2", a faint scar along his left jaw, a Brioni suit the color of wet ash, and in his hand, a gold Zippo engraved with the initials V.F., flicking open and closed, the way his father used to do when he was about to make a decision that couldn't be undone. On the desk in front of him sat 200 pages of bankruptcy filings that weren't real. Every number was a lie he'd engineered himself. Every signature line was bait. Somewhere inside his own organization, someone had been feeding his father's killers for 18 years, and Raymond had finally built a trap elegant enough to flush them out, a trap so precise, 3 outside forensic accountants had sworn on their licenses. It was airtight. He was about to sign. And then a voice behind him, quiet and shaking and somehow steady all at once, said, "Sir, you missed something." Not his consigliere, not his lawyers. A 27-year-old cleaning woman in a gray Meridian Services uniform, chestnut hair tied back, a hospital bill folded in her breast pocket, a 6-year-old daughter waiting for a heart surgery she couldn't afford, and a pair of green eyes that had no business looking him straight in the face. She held out a single sheet of paper. A billion-dollar empire about to collapse because of one overlooked number, or the only person in the building who could see the truth turning out to be the one nobody had ever bothered to look at. If you've ever been the person in a room full of smart people who noticed the thing nobody else did, stay with me, because this story was written for you. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let's go back to where it all began. 6 o'clock in the evening settled over Astoria the way it always settled over this neighborhood on every Tuesday in October, with that deep golden light pressing through the elevated train tracks and falling across the third-floor window of a studio apartment, barely wide enough for 3 women from 3 generations to breathe beneath the same roof. In the tiny kitchen, separated from the living room by a floral fabric curtain, Maggie Quinn stood stirring a pot of chicken soup with the wooden spoon she had used through 30 years of working night shifts as a nurse, her hand trembling ever so slightly in a rhythm that only those who have lived long enough would recognize as the rhythm of time rather than illness. She was 67 years old, her silver hair twisted into a high bun, a silver bracelet circling her wrist, the one her daughter had given her before dying of pancreatic cancer at the age of 33. She had raised Hazel from the time the girl was 9. She had been raising Poppy from the day that child was born. Right beside the soup pot, held to the refrigerator door by magnets, were 2 sheets of paper no one in this home dared take down, an old bill from Mount Sinai Kravis Children's Hospital, showing an outstanding balance of $47,382, and a brand new notice estimating $380,000 for the advanced heart surgery that the best surgeon on the East Coast didn't accept under their Medicaid network. At the little table for 2 set beside the window, Poppy Quinn, 6 years old, with blonde curls tied into 2 sides, tilted her head and used a green-colored pencil nearly out of lead to draw a heart in the corner of her first-grade math worksheet. The pencil had grown so short that Poppy had to pinch it between her thumb and forefinger the way someone might hold the last scrap of coal left in a stove. She was working on addition with carrying, and in the 7th box, she had written the number 23 with the confidence of a child who believed a teacher could never be wrong. Hazel Quinn stepped out from the narrow bathroom, her chestnut brown hair still damp and neatly tied back at the nape of her neck, her arms holding the gray Meridian Services uniform she had ironed flat the night before. Daddy, she was only 27. But when she passed the mirror hanging on the bathroom door, she no longer recognized the girl who had once been a 4th-year financial auditing student at NYU, the one Professor Whitlock had called the gem of the class. She sat down beside her daughter, reached for the worksheet, and lowered her eyes to the 7th line. "Poppy, are you sure about this one?" The little girl looked up, her voice sharpening with the wounded pride only children carry. "My teacher said I got it right, Mom." Hazel set the paper down very slowly, the way one might place a baby bird into an open palm. "Do you remember what I taught you? Always check twice, especially when people tell you that you've already got it right. Especially then, Poppy." The child let out a sigh in the way only children who already understand that everything their mother says has a reason behind it can sigh, then picked up her pencil and checked each step again in a whisper. Halfway through, her tiny mouth tightened, and she said softly, "I forgot to carry the one." Hazel didn't smile with triumph. She simply kissed the top of her daughter's head, where her hair still carried the sweet scent of lemon-yellow children's shampoo. Maggie turned from the stove, set a bowl of soup on the table for Poppy, then slipped a peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich into Hazel's uniform pocket, wrapped in a napkin on which Poppy had drawn a green heart with her own hand that morning. She touched her granddaughter's cheek lightly. "Be careful, sweetheart. Grandma and Poppy will wait for you to come home." Hazel rose to her feet, looked one last time at the 2 sheets of paper on the refrigerator, then bent down and kissed Poppy on the forehead. "I'm going to work. I'll be home late tonight, so go to sleep with Grandma first, okay?" The little girl nodded, already turned back to her worksheet, already holding that nearly spent green pencil to change the number 23 into the number 33. At 6:45, Hazel stepped out of the aging building on 31st Avenue, pulled a thin windbreaker over her shoulders, and stood at the Q101 bus stop, watching the city's yellow cars slide across the wet pavement. In her mind there were only 2 numbers, 47,000 and 380,000, and one promise she had repeated to herself for the past 8 months, every time she boarded the night bus, that one day, somehow, she would find a way through. And when the bus finally glided up beneath the yellow streetlights, she had no way of knowing that 5 miles to the west, on the 47th floor of a glass tower on Madison Avenue, that way through was already waiting for her to walk into it. At 7 o'clock that evening, at the very moment the Q101 bus had just carried Hazel across the Queensboro Bridge and turned into Midtown, the walnut doors of the main conference room on the 47th floor of Falcone Tower closed behind the 12 most highly paid people in New York in the professions they practiced. The light inside the room had been lowered to the level of a luxurious Italian restaurant, just enough to read numbers, not enough to read faces. Raymond Falcone sat at the head of the table, his Brioni jacket still buttoned, his right hand resting on the polished wood, his left dropped beneath the table where his fingers were turning, a gold Zippo engraved with the 2 letters V.F. in the rhythm of a man counting down to something only he knew was coming. Across from him, standing behind the presentation podium, was Jasper Wellington, 54 years old. The Wharton MBA diploma he kept framed in glass hanging in his private office exactly 3 doors down from this room. The sleeves of his white Turnbull and Acer shirt rolled to the elbows with a slow and deliberate motion that felt almost ritualistic, the gold ring engraved with the letter W on his little finger catching the light each time he pointed at the screen. He spoke in a low, gentle, steady voice, the voice of a man who had performed the part of the doctor delivering bad news so many times that he had come to believe he himself was grieving. Falcone Holdings, according to him, had crossed the line from liquidity strain into insolvency in the 2nd week of September. The losses in the European hedge fund had climbed to $68,472,000, and the cash flow for the next 30 days wasn't enough to cover employee salaries, much less debt. The 2 audit partners from Ernst & Young, both personally chosen by Raymond, and both unaware that they were nothing more than pieces on a much larger board, nodded along with each slide. The restructuring attorney, Miriam Delacroix, a woman of 50, in a black Brunello Cucinelli dress, had already opened her leather file to the page where Raymond's signature line waited at the bottom. No one in the room knew that every number Jasper was presenting had been designed by Raymond himself over the past 6 months, placed into the system with the precision of a jeweler setting stones into a ring, each hole carved just deep enough for a man waiting for the right moment to betray him, to reach in and be unable to pull his hand back out. No one knew, not even Miriam, not even the 2 auditors, not even Jasper, especially not Jasper. For 8 months, ever since one morning in February, when Raymond had accidentally uncovered 3 internal transfers routed through a shell company in Delaware that only Jasper had the authority to approve, he had lived in the state of a wolf, standing 3 steps from its prey, close enough to smell blood, not yet close enough to leap. He needed Jasper to put his own hand into the cuff. He needed Jasper to do the thing only a traitor does when he hears an empire is about to collapse. Rush to move assets to the enemy camp before the court can freeze them. Beneath the table, his phone vibrated once, softly. He glanced down. A message from Finn Gallagher, the 41-year-old man sitting in an unmarked civilian van at the corner of 51st Street and Madison Avenue. the man Raymond had played with since the age of 8 in Bensonhurst, and the man no member of the Falcone family except Raymond knew was an FBI agent. The message held only 4 words: "The cameras are ready," and a period. Raymond snapped the Zippo shut with a quiet click, lifted his head, and cut across Jasper's closing remarks in a voice so calm that the whole room fell silent. He would sign at 9 o'clock the next morning. He wanted the full board present. He wanted the statement released to the financial news wires the moment the ink was dry. Jasper nodded with the proper solemn gravity. But in the 3 seconds the 2 men held each other's eyes across the length of the walnut table, Raymond saw the thing he had been waiting 8 months to see, a hurried pulse at Jasper's jawbone, the pulse of a man already calculating who he had to call within the next 84 hours. At 9:31 that night, the room was empty. The chairs had been pushed in. The glasses had been taken away. The lights had dimmed 1 level lower on their own. Raymond stepped through the sliding glass doors onto the executive balcony, letting the October wind of Manhattan Island cut straight through the thin fabric of his jacket, and pulled out the second phone no one in this building knew he possessed. He dialed the only number in its contacts. On the other end, Finn Gallagher answered on the first ring. Raymond didn't greet him. He only said 4 words, 72 hours more, then ended the call, and stood for a long time at the railing, looking down at the yellow streams of light along 5th Avenue, while 32 floors below, a Q-101 bus had just reached its final stop, and a woman in a gray Meridian uniform stepped down onto the street. At 9 o'clock that night, while Raymond stood alone on the balcony of the 47th floor waiting for the night wind to cool the blood in his veins, 39 floors below him, the break room for the night cleaning crew on the 2nd basement level of Falcone Tower was glowing with that pale white fluorescent light only people who work past midnight ever learn to live with. The room was about 20 square meters, with a row of beige metal lockers chipped at the corners, a long table surrounded by 6 plastic chairs, an old coffee machine that let out a weary groan like an aging cat whenever someone pressed the button, and the smell of Clorox bleach mixed with burnt coffee into a scent so particular that Hazel had learned how not to notice it anymore. She sat down in the chair nearest the door, took off her windbreaker, and pulled from the pocket of her uniform the sandwich Maggie had tucked there 3 hours earlier before she left home. The napkin wrapped around it had a green heart drawn on it by Poppy, the pencil line broken in places where the lead had nearly run dry, and in the lower corner the child had carefully written 3 words, "My mommy." Hazel stared at that heart for a long time before unwrapping it, because she knew that if she looked at it 1 second longer, she would cry, and she had promised herself 8 months ago that she wouldn't cry in the Meridian Services break room. She unlocked her phone and tapped FaceTime. Poppy's round face appeared after 3 rings. The little girl had already had her bath, was wearing pink pajamas scattered with tiny stars, and her hair was tied to one side in the crooked ponytail Maggie always made for her. "Mommy." I checked it again. "The number is 33. The teacher really was wrong." Hazel had to press her lips together to keep from laughing, because she knew the teacher wasn't wrong and it was Poppy who had written it down incorrectly. But in the world of a 6-year-old who had just discovered that grown-ups could be wrong too, that pride was something no one should touch. "You did such a good job, Poppy. Do you remember the lesson Mommy taught you?" The little girl nodded so hard it was almost frantic. "Always check twice, especially when people tell me I've already got it right." Behind her, in the warm spill of light from an old table lamp, Maggie was sitting in a striped, upholstered armchair, her feet resting on a low padded stool, her hands moving knitting needles back and forth through lemon-yellow yarn as she worked on a scarf for Poppy to wear when winter came. She lifted her eyes toward the screen and nodded at Hazel without saying a word, because those 2 women had learned long ago that on some evenings, speaking less was the way to love each other more. Hazel told Poppy to go to sleep early because she had school in the morning, then kissed the phone screen. Poppy kissed the screen from the other side, and then the display went dark. Hazel turned the phone face down on the table so she wouldn't have to look at it anymore, and it was at that exact moment that the break room door swung open. Toby Parker came in holding 2 cups of coffee, 29 years old, lanky and tall, with white dust still clinging to the shoulder of his uniform from the 12th floor, where he had just cleaned the photocopy room. His wife, Kelly, was pregnant with their first child at 37 weeks, and for the past 3 months, Toby had turned every night shift into a one-man comedy show, so he wouldn't have to think about the fact that if the baby came tonight, he would have to catch the N train and ride 40 minutes before he could make it back to Astoria. "Coffee for the lady," he said, setting 1 cup down in front of Hazel. "Burnt on schedule." burnt with professionalism, burnt exactly like every Tuesday night. Hazel lifted the cup, inhaled once, then set it back down. Toby dropped into the chair across from her, glanced at the sheet of paper sticking out from her uniform pocket, and saw that it was an internal bulletin from Human Resources she had pulled from a trash can on the 32nd floor during the previous shift. He shook his head with mock sorrow. Digging through discarded reports again. Miss Quinn, I've told you how many times now, this company doesn't pay extra for that hobby. Hazel smiled from only one corner of her mouth and gave a little shrug. Just an old habit from back when I still thought I'd become an auditor. Toby took a sip of coffee, made a face, then stood up. All right, big sister, time to head to the 47th floor. You know the big boss hates half-finished lattes left sitting overnight. Hazel rose with him, folded the napkin with the green heart, carefully slipped it into the inner pocket of her uniform, the place closest to her heart, and picked up the janitorial cart key. The two cleaners stepped out of the break room, pushed their carts into the service elevator, and Toby pressed the button for the 32nd floor first. Hazel pressed the one for the 47th floor after him, not knowing that within the next 8 minutes, one of their carts would strike the edge of a walnut desk, and the bottom drawer of her life would be pulled open. The service elevator let Hazel out on the 47th floor into a long corridor paved in smoke-gray marble that always felt colder to her than the rest of the building, as though the air this high up had been filtered through a different layer of glass, a layer meant for people who never had to think about the electric bill. She pushed the cleaning cart out of the elevator, its wheels whispering over the stone, and followed the familiar path to the main conference room in the northeast corner of the tower. The cleaning crew keycard touched the reader, the walnut door glided open without a sound, and Hazel stepped inside with the posture of someone who had repeated this exact motion for 212 nights in a row, head lowered, eyes on the floor, not looking at the table, not looking at the chairs, not looking at anything that might make someone think she had read what didn't belong to her. The lighting in the room was still kept at the level of a restaurant after dark. She switched on the overhead auxiliary lights, and the room revealed itself in the stillness of a stage that had just gone dark after the curtain fell. On the 14-seat walnut table, there were 3 paper latte cups printed with the logo of the Intelligentsia Cafe downstairs, each still about 1/3 full, one marked with a deep red lipstick stain on the rim, one half-finished bottle of S. Pellegrino, and a stack of gray file folders placed neatly at the head of the table between the 2 coffee cups, as though whoever had left it there had done so on purpose. Hazel walked straight to the far end of the table and began where she always began, lifting each latte cup into the black trash bag, wiping the tabletop with a microfiber cloth dampened with disinfectant, wiping the chair legs, pushing each chair back into its correct position, exactly 23 centimeters from the edge of the table. She had reached the 7th chair when her steps stopped, because right there on the table, just before she moved the lipstick-stained cup, her eyes passed over the 7th page of the file stack. Financial Summary, Appendix C. The first 8 lines were a table of losses by geographic region, and on the 3rd line, the one showing the total losses of the European hedge fund, the figure, printed in bold, was $68,472,000. Hazel hadn't meant to read it. She had never meant to read anything, but that number, 68 million, lodged itself in her eyes like a shard of broken glass. Her hand froze in midair. A week earlier, during the Thursday night shift, she had pulled from a trash bin on the 32nd floor a draft of Appendix B from this very same Appendix C. She had taken it to the break room and read it between sips of burnt coffee, and the total European loss on that draft, she remembered clearly, because she possessed the kind of visual memory that had once made Professor Richard Whitlock at NYU point straight at her in front of the entire class in the spring of 2019 and call her the girl immune to pattern blindness, saying that in 22 years of teaching forensic auditing, he had never seen a student who could spot displaced numbers as fast as she could. The figure on that draft had been 68,427,427, not 472. The 2 final digits had switched places, and in the world of people who read financial statements in a hurry, a discrepancy of $45,000 inside a figure of 68 million was the deadliest kind of discrepancy, because it was too small for most people to notice and too specific to be accidental. Her heart began pounding so hard that she could hear it through the fabric of her uniform. She put a hand on the edge of the cart to steady herself. This was a transposition error, The kind of error Whitlock had taught her from the very first lecture. The kind that played the role of the first fingerprint in 90% of financial embezzlement cases in America, because the human mind never flips numbers at random. It flips them when a real number is being hidden behind them. She bent closer and looked again at the 2 pages. Yes. In this Appendix C, page 7, 3rd line. In the Appendix B from the trash bin last week, page 11, 5th line. Same category, same region, a difference of exactly $45,000. If someone traced it backward, that amount had either been moved out of the system by one deliberate keystroke, or it was sitting in an offshore account no one in tonight's meeting had mentioned. Hazel closed her eyes. She thought of Poppy asleep beside her grandmother on the narrow bed in Astoria. She thought of the surgery estimate for $380,000 taped to the refrigerator. She thought of the green pencil worn almost to nothing. She thought of the sentence she had taught her daughter every night for the past 8 months. Always check twice. She opened her eyes, reached for the paper, copied both numbers onto the back of the napkin in her pocket. And at the exact moment her fingers folded the napkin shut, the sliding glass door to the balcony behind her trembled with the faintest sound. The sound of a man stepping in from the wind. Hazel hadn't even turned around before she heard the sound of leather soles striking the marble floor. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3. The footsteps of a man who wasn't hurrying, because nothing in this building could force him to hurry. She hid the napkin on which she had just copied the 2 figures into her left palm, closed her fingers around it, then straightened up, kept her eyes on the side of the cleaning cart, and drew in one long breath to try to slow her heartbeat. Raymond Falcone stopped 4 steps away from her. One hand slipped into his trouser pocket, the other holding the gold Zippo now shut, and looked at her with gray eyes that for the first 9 seconds showed nothing except the alert stillness of a hunter who had just discovered a fresh set of tracks in the snow. When he spoke, his voice was very soft, very even. The kind of softness and evenness that anyone who had worked with him long enough knew was more dangerous than shouting. "What are you doing with my files?" Hazel lifted her head, and in that instant, she understood that the man standing before her wasn't the ordinary CEO of an ordinary company. She had read enough discarded financial reports over the past 8 months to know that the numbers Falcone Holdings moved through the world didn't belong to any world. A woman with her name was meant to enter, and this man, in the ash-colored suit, damp from the night air, with the faint scar along his left jaw, was the one who stood at the center of that world. She could lie. She could say, "I'm sorry. I saw it by accident." She could throw the napkin from her pocket into the trash bag and push her cart out of the room and lose her job but keep her life. She thought of the $380,000 on the refrigerator. She thought of the sentence she had taught Poppy exactly 3 hours earlier, and she chose the worst thing a cleaning woman could choose in front of Raymond Falcone. "Sir, you missed a detail." The Zippo stopped turning in Raymond's hand. Hazel opened her left palm, placed the napkin on the corner of the table, then used one faintly trembling finger to point at the 3rd line of Appendix C lying open on the table, and then at the 2 numbers she had just written in blue pen on the napkin. Last week, in a draft of Appendix B that I happened to see on the 32nd floor, the total loss of the European fund was listed as $68,427,000. Tonight, in Appendix C, it's listed as $68,472,000. The last 2 digits have been reversed. The discrepancy is $45,000. In forensic auditing, this kind of error is called a transposition error, and it usually isn't a mistake. It's usually the fingerprint of a real number that's been hidden in another account. She said it all in one breath. Not one word too many, not one word too few, then closed her lips and waited for judgment. Raymond didn't answer right away. He stepped forward once, looked down at the page, looked down at the napkin, looked up at Hazel's face, then looked back at the page again. In those 3 seconds, nothing moved on his face. But inside his mind, one door had just opened while another had slammed shut at the same time. $45,000 was the anchor figure he himself had ordered the internal chief accountant, Felix Crane, to plant into the Appendix B draft 3 weeks earlier, so the fake numbers would align with a shell account in the 4 Caymans, then deliberately reverse in Appendix C, so that the 3 forensic auditors he had hired from outside under false identities wouldn't be able to see the trail. Those 3 men, each paid $200,000, had sworn on their professional licenses that the file was flawless, without a single crack, and now a woman pushing a cleaning cart in a gray Meridian uniform had found it in 8 minutes. He hadn't even had time to say a word when the conference room door behind them flew open. Jasper Wellington stepped in with the air of a man who had just remembered he'd left something behind. His black laptop still resting on the chair at the head of the table opposite, and the eyes of a 54-year-old man who had done business on Wall Street for more than 3 decades needed only half a second to assess the entire scene. A cleaner standing in front of the Don, a handwritten napkin on the table. Appendix C opened to page 7, and Raymond saying nothing. Jasper moved fast, snatched the napkin off the table in a motion he cleverly masked behind the outrage of a loyal subordinate, then pulled out his phone and dialed Dwight Hollis at the ground floor security desk. "Dwight, get up to the 47th floor now. We've got a breach involving internal documents." He turned to Hazel, his voice going hard like metal. "What did you steal? Do you have any idea that what you just copied is worth more than your entire lifetime of wages?" Hazel went pale. The fold of her uniform at the shoulder trembled once, but she didn't step back. Raymond raised one hand, only one hand, palm facing Jasper, and the entire 47th floor room fell into that kind of silence only people who had served the Falcone family long enough would know how to recognize. Then he spoke 5 words, very slowly, very softly. "Let her say the rest." Those 5 words fell into the conference room like a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. And Jasper Wellington, though he had worked beside Raymond Falcone for 18 years, still knew that there were certain sentences in a consigliere's life he wasn't allowed to argue with for more than a single beat. He tightened his grip on the napkin in his hand, opened his mouth as if to speak, but Raymond had already turned toward him with a look that needed only half a second for Jasper to understand. "Call Dwight back. Tell him not to come up. Go back to your office. I'll handle this." Jasper nodded with the rigid motion of a man forcing a sentence back down his throat after it had already risen to his mouth, placed the napkin back on the corner of the table as though returning something that had been stripped of his claim to it, then walked out through the door, and in the 3 seconds it took for his back to disappear beyond the frame, Hazel noticed that his left hand turned the gold ring engraved with the letter W on his little finger exactly twice, the first turn clockwise, the second against it. The walnut door closed. Raymond pulled a chair to a spot 2 steps away from Hazel, set it down across from her at the edge of the table, and gestured with emotion so close to courtesy that it startled her for a second, inviting her to sit. She sat down, knees pressed together, both hands resting on her lap to hide the trembling. Raymond placed the Zippo on the table between them, the lighter standing upright on its base, the 2 letters V, F, facing her like a silent witness. He didn't waste time. "Who are you?" "Hazel Quinn, 27 years old, Meridian Services employee, night shift in this building for 212 nights. Where did you study auditing?" "NYU, 4th year, didn't graduate, dropped out in 2020. Raymond didn't ask why she had dropped out. He didn't need to ask. There were gaps inside an answer that a man like him had long ago learned how to read. He looked at her for another 3 seconds, then asked the second question, the one he had used exactly 14 times in his life to test a human being. And in those 14 times, 13 people had given him the same answer. "What do you want? Money? How much?" Hazel lowered her eyes to the Zippo, then lifted them back to his face. And in that short half-second she had already solved a problem no auditing school had ever taught her. If she took money, the money would have to move through an account. The account would have to carry a name. The name would have to explain the source. And in the world of this man, a large sum transferred without reason to a cleaning woman was a thread someone could pull from both ends, her end and Poppy's. "Sir," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I don't want money." Raymond lifted one eyebrow slightly, for the first time in 14 tests, and leaned back in his chair a little. "Then what do you want?" Hazel swallowed. "I want you to promise me one thing. One promise only. Within 1 year from tonight, at any moment, I have the right to call you and ask you to help me with one thing. One thing only. One time only. Anything at all. Within your power. As long as it doesn't break the law and doesn't hurt anyone. And you'll do it. That's my price." The room went still. Raymond looked at her for a very long time. He had met rivals who named prices in the hundreds of millions, and he had turned them down in 3 seconds. He had met senators who named the price of a cabinet seat, and he had laughed in their faces. He had never met a cleaning woman who asked for a promise. And the reason she asked for a promise, he understood within 4 heartbeats, was that she was smarter than he had judged her to be in the first 6 minutes, because she had realized that a promise left no trace, passed through no accounting system, and appeared in no file belonging to any investigative agency, and was the only thing that could bind a man like him without exposing her in the process. In the world of the Falcone family, the Don's promise weighed more than a notarized contract. She had chosen the right currency, and within those same 4 heartbeats, he thought one more thing. She will fail. His trap had been certified by 3 of the best forensic auditors money could buy, men who had sworn on their licenses, and there was no way she could unravel it in 6 hours. And when she failed, he would have a more interesting evening than he had planned. Then he would have her sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement, move $30,000 to her through the company charity fund as employee assistance, and forget her. He extended his right hand across the table. I agree. But if you can't trace the path of that $45,000 and give me the name of the final account before 6 o'clock in the morning, you'll sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement and never set foot in this building again. Hazel reached out her hand. Her hand was small and cold, her fingers still carrying the scent of disinfectant. His hand was warm and heavy, the skin dry, and when her fingers brushed against the joint of his little finger, she felt beneath the skin a hard, narrow scar running across it, thin as thread, a scar she knew hadn't come from an office. They shook hands. The Zippo remained standing between them, the letters V, F, catching the light, and the clock on the wall struck 11 o'clock. Raymond led Hazel down a side corridor she was normally allowed to walk through only after the lights had been turned off, to a small workroom beside his private office, a room with nothing in it but a rectangular wooden desk, 2 leather chairs, a desktop computer with 2 monitors, and a dark brown leather sofa set beneath a black and white photograph of Brooklyn Harbor in winter. He entered the password with 3 fingers. The screen lit up, and he pushed the chair toward her. Appendices C, B, and A are all open. You have access to the subsidiary ledgers. You can trace the intermediary accounts from January until now. You don't have access to the accounts marked in red, because those are legally sensitive transactions. 6 o'clock in the morning is the limit, and I'll be sitting right here. Hazel nodded. She took off her windbreaker, folded it, set it across her knees, pushed the napkin with the 2 numbers written on it to the corner of the desk like a compass, and began to type. Raymond sat down on the sofa, pulled a gray cloth-bound book from the low shelf, The Prince by Machiavelli, worn thin at all 4 corners, opened it to page 123, where he had dog-eared it 6 months earlier, and pretended to read. During the first half hour, he turned the page exactly twice, and both times his eyes didn't travel across a single line. Hazel had disappeared into the screen, her shoulders curved forward with the posture of someone who had once spent the last 2 years of college, bent over Excel sheets 1,000 rows long, her fingers moving fast but never hard. And those green eyes of hers were reading numbers in a way Raymond had seen only twice before in his life. In his chief accountant Felix Crane, and in an SEC investigator who had chased the Falcone family for 3 years before Jasper arranged a new job for her in Boston. At 11:19, she stopped typing. She turned the napkin over, wrote 3 small lines in blue ink on the blank side, then looked up. Sir, the $45,000 discrepancy moved through an intermediary account at the Cayman National Bank branch, under the corporate name Meridian Shore Holdings LLC, registered in Grand Cayman in March of this year, with a paper owner listed as a man named Desmond Riley. Raymond lowered the book onto his lap. He knew Desmond Riley didn't exist. It was a name Felix himself had created under Raymond's instructions 6 months earlier to anchor this trap, and there was no way for an outsider to trace that name from a transposed figure unless they knew how to read the metadata of SWIFT transactions in a very particular way. He said nothing, only nodded once, and Hazel turned back to the screen. At 11:43, she stopped a second time. Meridian Shore isn't the final point, sir. That money was transferred onward the same day, through a second transfer worth $41,800, with the difference of $3,200 taken as intermediary fees, to a second shell company in Panama City called Castellano Maritime Services S.A., registered in April of this year. Raymond shut the book completely. Castellano Maritime was also a name he had created, but it had been planted at a deeper level of the system. In a layer he had paid an extra $100,000 to a database engineer in Zurich to hide beneath 3 layers of false encryption. His 3 forensic auditors hadn't found Meridian Shore. Not one of the 3 had gotten as far as Castellano Maritime, A woman in a gray uniform, sitting at a desktop computer, with no accounting degree, no specialized software, armed only with visual memory and 6 hours, had gone farther than $300,000 worth of forensic auditing in 43 minutes. He asked a question he had never intended to ask when he brought her into this room. "Why did you leave NYU in 2020? Hazel didn't lift her eyes from the screen. "Because of family, sir. Something happened at home. I was the only one who could stay, so I stayed." She didn't say more. She didn't speak Maggie's name. Didn't say when her mother had died. Didn't say that she had become pregnant at the age of 21. Didn't speak of the little girl sleeping on a narrow bed in Astoria, with a green pencil almost out of lead in the pencil box beside her pillow. Raymond didn't ask anything else. He had heard enough silence in her voice to know she was hiding 1/3 of her life, and he had lived long enough to understand that that hidden third was the very reason she was sitting here now. For the next 30 minutes, he didn't pretend to read anymore. He set the prints down on the coffee table, shifted forward to the edge of the sofa, and watched her work the way a man watches a Go player opening a pattern he has never seen anyone open before. The wall clock edged past 11:46. Hazel typed one final export command, printed out a single sheet of A4 paper from the printer in the corner of the room, took the page while it was still warm, walked it over to Raymond's desk, and placed it in front of him at the exact moment the clock struck 11:47. The A4 sheet of paper lay between them for a full minute and a half without either of them touching it. Then Raymond picked it up, skimmed it once, read it carefully a second time, and set it down beside the Zippo still standing upright at the edge of the desk. He said, "That's enough. You may go back to work," in a voice so calm that Hazel almost believed he hadn't found anything unusual in it at all. She returned to the chair in front of the 2 monitors and kept typing. And for the next hour or so, the room held nothing but the sound of keys, the hum of the computer fan, and the distant cry of ambulance sirens rising faintly from Madison Avenue 32 floors below. Hazel followed the money the way a person follows a thread through darkness. From Castellano Maritime in Panama, she traced a third transfer to a trust account in Luxembourg, under the name Harrow Trust. From Harrow Trust, she jumped to a fourth company registered in the British Virgin Islands called Northfield Capital Advisors. And from Northfield, she saw the money move in a strange reverse current, not onward, but looping back into an intermediary account in Delaware inside the United States, before branching out again into 5 smaller offshoots. At 1:20 in the morning, she stopped typing. She sat perfectly still for 5 seconds, her eyes fixed on the monitor to the left, and in those 5 seconds something in her mind came together the way 2 shards of broken glass lock cleanly into place. She opened 4 separate tabs, 3 containing the corporate registration records for Meridian Shore Holdings, Castellano Maritime Services, and Northfield Capital Advisors, and the 4th containing the corporate file for Harrow Trust. She lined the 4 pages up side by side on one screen. She looked. The registration date of the first entity was March 17th. The second was April 19th. The third was April 22nd. The fourth was May 11th. All 4 fell neatly within a span of 55 days. But the thing that sent a cold wave through her body wasn't the timing. All 4 registration agreements used the same legal document template, the same 52-clause structure, the same Roman numeral formatting in the appendices, and when she scrolled down to the digital signature box in the lower right corner of each file, those 4 digital signatures shared the same strange timestamp format, the same final 3 characters in the hash string, the same certificate ID issued by the same provider in Zurich. A person hiding real money would never leave behind 4 entities with the same electronic fingerprint inside 55 days, because that was the fastest way for Interpol to pull one thread and connect the entire chain. Someone would do this only if they didn't need to hide, only if they wanted someone to find it. Hazel leaned back in her chair very slowly. She understood. The numbers in Appendix C weren't wrong. They had been designed to be wrong in exactly the right way. The transposition error on the 3rd line of page 7 wasn't the mistake of a tired accountant. It was a door deliberately left cracked open, just narrow enough for 3 professional forensic auditors to glance through and walk away, just wide enough for someone inside this organization, someone who already knew where to look, to step through and expose himself. The entire stack of bankruptcy files on the conference table tonight had been a net stretched out over the sea, and the man sitting on the leather sofa behind her, with the prints open on his lap, and the gold Zippo engraved with VF, in his pocket, was the one who had cast that net. She let out a breath. She hadn't saved him from bankruptcy. She had walked into a trap that was never meant for her. She had two choices in the next 3 seconds. She could pretend she didn't understand and go back to typing some harmless conclusion, take his promise, and walk away believing she had survived. Or she could say aloud what she had just seen. She thought of the sentence she had taught Poppy 3 hours earlier. She thought of the scar across the little finger joint of the man who had just shaken her hand, and she understood that if she pretended not to understand, he would know she was pretending, because men like him didn't stay alive until 37 by trusting people, but by recognizing the exact moment a woman suddenly stays silent for more than 3 heartbeats. She turned her chair to face him, and lowered her voice into a whisper just soft enough that no one outside this room could hear it, not even the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. "Sir, you aren't about to go bankrupt. You're baiting someone." Raymond didn't answer at once. He looked at her for 4 beats. Then he set the prints face down on the coffee table, and the silence in the room became something with weight. Raymond stood up, walked around the coffee table, crossed to the low wooden cabinet set against the wall, poured himself a glass of 18-year-old Macallan whiskey, and poured Hazel a glass of mineral water, then placed both glasses on the table between them, with the slow, deliberate movements of a man deciding how much truth he should speak in a single night. He sat down across from her, no longer leaning back into the sofa, both elbows resting on his knees, and he said only one sentence: "Yes, you're right." He had stretched this net out since March. Every number in that stack of files had been designed by him personally. Every shell company was a way station planted in advance, and the purpose was to force someone inside his organization, someone who had sold him out to the man who killed his father 18 years earlier, to move assets in a hurry to the opposing side within 72 hours after the bankruptcy news was released. And within those 72 hours, the traitor would walk with his own hands into that very Delaware account she had just found. He had eaten and slept beside this plan for 212 nights, and she had broken it open in 6 hours. Hazel placed both hands on her lap to keep them from trembling. She asked, "And what about me, sir?" Raymond took one very small sip of whiskey, set the glass down, then pulled a brown-gray envelope from inside his jacket and placed it on the table between them. When she stepped into the conference room at 9:38 that night, the hallway camera had identified her face and sent her personnel file to his phone within 20 seconds. That was an automatic procedure he had applied to everyone who crossed the door of the 47th floor after 9 o'clock at night for the past 4 years. By now, he knew her name was Hazel Quinn, 27 years old, born in Astoria, Queens, an academic honors student in her final year at Frank Sinatra High School, admitted to NYU in financial auditing in 2016, with an expected graduating average of 3.94, and withdrawn in the final semester of 2020. He knew she lived with her grandmother, Margaret Quinn, 67 years old, a former pediatric nurse at Elmhurst Hospital. He knew she had a daughter named Poppy, 6 years old, waiting for heart surgery at Mount Sinai Kravis. He knew about the debt of $47,382 and the estimated $380,000 taped to her refrigerator door. He didn't open the envelope. He only placed it in front of her as a way of saying that his world had known her before she ever knew his. Hazel stared at the envelope and didn't dare touch it. And for one very brief moment, she felt as if she had been stripped bare in the middle of the room. Raymond didn't let her stay inside that feeling for long. He said, "You have 2 choices. The first choice is that you take my promise. Sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement tonight. Forget everything you've seen, and go home to your grandmother and your daughter. And within the next year, if you need to call me, you have the right to call exactly 1 time. The second choice is that you stay. You help me cast this net the right way so the traitor shows his face within the next 72 hours. You work under my protection. And when this is over, Poppy's surgery will be performed within 48 hours at Mount Sinai Kravis by the leading pediatric cardiac surgeon on the East Coast, with every cost paid through a lawful assistance fund that can't be traced back to me. That's my money, not my promise." Hazel stayed silent for a very long time. She thought of her mother dying 18 years earlier because there hadn't been enough money to treat an illness that people can now cure in 3 months. She thought of Poppy sleeping in Astoria in her pink pajamas, with a heartbeat 20 beats slower than that of an ordinary child. She thought of the moment, more than 3 hours earlier, when she had kissed her daughter on the forehead. Then she said, "I'll stay, but you have to swear one thing to me, and if you don't swear it, I'll get up, walk out of this room, and walk all the way to the N train." Raymond said, "Say it." Hazel looked straight into his gray eyes, and she spoke each word as if hammering nails into a door she never wanted anyone to open behind her again. You have to swear, on your father's soul, that my family, Margaret Quinn, my grandmother, and Poppy Quinn, my daughter, will never, under any circumstance, whether you're alive or dead, be pulled into the world you're living in. Poppy will never know your name. My grandmother will never meet you. Your name will never appear in a letter, a check, or a phone call to my home. Can you promise that? Raymond didn't answer at once. He pulled the gold Zippo engraved with the two letters V, F, from the inside pocket of his jacket, placed it on the table between them, flicked the lid open with his thumb in a soft metallic click, and let the flame rise between their faces. He looked at her through that flame, and he said, I swear on the soul of Vincenzo Falcone, my father, who was shot to death in the room 4 doors from here when I was 19 years old, that I will never let your family cross the threshold of my world. He snapped the Zippo shut. The flame went out. Hazel nodded once, and the longest night of her life officially began. At 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Manhattan had already begun to flow in the rhythm of an ordinary workday. And in the main corridor on the 47th floor of Falcone Tower, Hazel Quinn walked forward in a smoke-gray suit borrowed from the reserve wardrobe of Raymond's personal assistant, her hair tied low, a temporary guest badge at her wrist, bearing the title Independent Consulting Auditor, and in her hands a cream-colored file 92 pages thick, the final report that she and Raymond had rewritten together in the last 3 hours of the night before, every figure reset in exactly a new way, every conclusion constructed so that a reader, who was just intelligent enough, would see that the $45,000 discrepancy had been traced to the Delaware account, and that the bankruptcy proceeding that morning would be postponed for 3 weeks for an internal investigation. At the far end of the corridor, at the exact moment Hazel passed the row of main elevators, Jasper Wellington's office door swung open, and the 54-year-old man stepped out with a cup of black coffee in his hand, his shirt freshly changed today, but his sleeves rolled up again in exactly 3 folds, like a habit he couldn't break. The gold ring engraved with the letter W still on his little finger. Hazel pretended to hesitate, her face slightly pale, breathing a little too hard, then hugged the file tightly to her chest like someone who had just made a mistake. Jasper stopped, smiled with the kind of smile a fox learns after years of pretending to be a kindly old man, and said, Miss Quinn, is it? Don Raymond mentioned you this morning. Did he give you an assignment? Hazel swallowed, looked down at the file, then raised her eyes. Sir, Mr. Wellington, last night I traced the path of a discrepancy in Appendix C. Don Raymond told me to bring the official copy to your office so you could review it before the 9 o'clock meeting is postponed. He said you're the first person who needs to know. She held the file out with both hands, the way a trainee employee hands a report to a superior. Her head bowed slightly. Jasper reached for the file, thanked her in a perfectly measured, warm voice, and in the very instant, his first 3 fingertips touched the cream cover. Hazel saw the pulse at his wrist jump faster by 1 beat. Only 1 beat, but she had learned how to watch the pulse in a patient's wrist from Maggie when she was still a child. 15 minutes later, the security camera by the exit onto Madison Avenue captured Jasper Wellington, stepping down the front steps with a charcoal cashmere coat over one arm, climbing into a black Lincoln already waiting at the curb, and disappearing into the morning traffic of Manhattan. Raymond stood on the balcony of the 47th floor, his phone to his ear, while Finn Gallagher on the other end said the car was being followed. 3 undercover FBI units were tailing it, signal strong. 16 minutes later, the Lincoln stopped in front of the Plaza Hotel at the corner of 5th Avenue and 59th Street. Jasper stepped out, went straight up to the presidential suite on the 18th floor, reserved under the name of a Delaware trading company, and inside that suite, seated in a leather armchair beside the window looking out over Central Park, was Don Archibald Barlow, 62 years old, silver hair combed straight back, wearing a midnight blue 3-piece suit from Savile Row, the head of the Barlow Mafia family in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and the blood enemy of the Falcone line for nearly 4 decades. The conversation lasted 22 minutes, and no audio was captured because the room had been swept against eavesdropping, but Finn's hidden camera inside the flower vase on the balcony recorded every expression. Jasper placed the cream-colored file on the table. Don Barlow opened it, read for 18 minutes, then looked up and asked 3 questions. Jasper nodded 3 times. The 2 men shook hands. Raymond watched the video feed live in his office with Finn at 11:12 that morning, and he closed his eyes for 3 seconds, because 18 years of waiting had finally taken shape. He said to Finn, 72 hours. Finn nodded. But what Raymond didn't see, what no camera captured, was the moment 2 minutes before Jasper left the presidential suite, when he stood at the glass doors looking down over the park and said one single sentence to Don Barlow that made even Barlow frown. There was a cleaning woman at Falcone Tower last night who traced Meridian Shore in 40 minutes. Her name is Hazel Quinn. She isn't an accident. She's a vulnerability. And I won't go to the final step with a vulnerability behind my back. Don Barlow gave a quiet laugh, took a sip of his drink, and said, "Handle it however you see fit, as long as my name doesn't touch it." Jasper nodded, closed the suite door, stepped into the elevator, and in the elevator descending to the plaza lobby, he pulled out a second phone that even Raymond didn't know he had, dialed a contact not saved in its memory, and spoke 6 words into the ear of the person on the other end. "Astoria, the address I sent. Noon today." At 1:29 in the afternoon, Hazel was sitting in the small workroom where she had been working the night before in front of the 2 monitors, this time with a bowl of chicken salad and a cup of Starbucks coffee that Raymond's personal assistant had placed on the desk half an hour earlier, though she still hadn't been able to eat a single bite because her stomach had been knotted tight ever since she caught sight of Jasper receiving the cream-colored file that morning. Her personal phone, lying face down beside the computer, gave the faintest vibration. A message notification from a number not saved in her contacts. The area code wasn't New York, it wasn't an ordinary mobile number, but one generated through a one-time encrypted service. She turned the phone over. The screen showed a single photograph, with no caption. Her apartment on the 3rd floor of 31st Avenue in Astoria. The front door had been forced off its hinges. The little dining table for 2 by the window had been overturned. The bowl of chicken soup Maggie had cooked the night before lay shattered across the laminate floor, and in the center of the frame, Maggie Quinn was sitting in Poppy's chair, her wrists bound behind her back with plastic zip ties, a strip of gray tape covering her mouth, her silver hair fallen loose from its bun, and on her left cheek was a bright red mark from a slap that hadn't yet had time to darken into a bruise. Her eyes weren't panicked. Her eyes were looking straight into the camera with the hard steadiness of a woman who had seen 30 years of emergency rooms. 3 seconds after the image finished loading, the phone vibrated a second time. Not a message now, but an incoming call from the same number. Hazel answered with a hand that had already gone numb. Jasper Wellington's voice came through on the other end, still low and warm, still precise, still the same voice he had used to greet her 6 hours earlier in the corridor on the 47th floor, with only one difference now. There was no false smile left inside it. "Miss Quinn, listen to me this one time only. You've stepped into a gamble that doesn't belong to you. But I'm not an unreasonable man. I only want one thing, and if you give me that one thing, your grandmother will be home safely before midnight tonight. At 11 o'clock tonight, you'll bring Don Raymond Falcone, along with the complete original set of the trap files, to the Red Hook Terminal Warehouse on the west side of Brooklyn. I'll text you the exact coordinates later. Raymond comes alone. No security team. No FBI. No Finn Gallagher. No Dwight Hollis. No one in your organization knows except you and Raymond. If I see one suspicious vehicle within a radius of 3 blocks, your grandmother won't be coming home. If I see Raymond carrying anything other than the stack of papers, your grandmother won't be coming home. And by the way, your daughter, Poppy, 6 years old, has been in Class 1B at Public School PS 122 on 21st Avenue in Astoria since 8:02 this morning. Her teacher's name is Hannah Brennan. Light blue uniform shirt with a rabbit logo. I know everything. I haven't touched the little girl. I won't touch the little girl if you do exactly what you're told. That's my gift to you, because I'm not an immoral man. But don't test me, Miss Quinn. Don't test me even once." The line went dead. Hazel didn't set the phone down right away. She couldn't. Her fingers had frozen around the plastic shell of it, and for the next 14 seconds, she didn't breathe. Maggie's photograph was still glowing on the screen. She stared into her grandmother's eyes, the eyes that had stayed awake through so many nights with her when she was pregnant with Poppy at 21, the eyes that had counted every breath Poppy took in her first week out of the incubator at Elmhurst, the eyes that looked at Hazel every Wednesday morning when she came home from the night shift and said, "Go to sleep. I've taken care of everything." Hazel's knees gave way before her mind could choose any action at all. and she slid from the chair onto the gray carpet, her back against the leg of the desk, while the phone slipped from her hand and fell face down on the floor. No sob came out of her throat. No sound came out at all. Only the faintest noise, like air being forced through a narrow tube. And she sat there like that on the floor of Falcone Tower, on the 47th floor, 5 miles from her daughter, 5 miles from her grandmother too, and didn't know that just beyond the door of the small workroom, less than 4 meters away, Raymond Falcone had just stepped out of the elevator with a file in his hand and heard something hit the floor. Raymond pushed open the door to the small workroom with his elbow, because both of his hands were full of files, and the first thing he saw wasn't the desk, wasn't the untouched bowl of chicken salad, but a smoke-gray shape curled up at the foot of it. He dropped the stack of files onto the sofa in one quick motion, crossed the room in 3 strides, and when he knelt beside Hazel, the instinct of a man who had watched too many people fall apart in his lifetime told him at once that this wasn't an ordinary panic attack. Hazel wasn't crying out loud. She was only shaking, her whole body trembling to the rhythm of breaths that were too fast and too shallow. And when Raymond touched her shoulder, it was cold as if she had been sitting in the snow for 30 minutes. He picked up the phone lying face down on the floor, turned it over, and saw the photograph. In the 2 seconds he spent looking at Margaret Quinn tied to Poppy's chair, Raymond understood 3 things at once. Jasper had known about Hazel before he ever left the plaza. His 72-hour plan had just been cut down to 9.5 hours. And for the first time in 18 years since the night his father was shot dead 4 doors away, someone in his world was in pain for a reason he couldn't refuse to carry. He set the phone aside, took off the suit jacket he was wearing, draped it over Hazel's shoulders, then sat down on the floor beside her with his back against the same desk leg, and he said nothing for nearly a minute. Hazel spoke first, her voice breaking into pieces. "She raised me from the time I was 9, sir. My mother died of pancreatic cancer at 33 in Elmhurst Hospital, and I was in 4th grade gym class when it happened. I ran across 5 blocks in the rain to get there, but I was 7 minutes too late. She was the only one in the waiting room. She took me home that night. She has been with me every night since then. She knitted the first blue scarf I ever had when I was in 8th grade. She took me to my NYU interview. She sat behind me in the delivery room when I gave birth to Poppy. She never once, not one single time, blamed me for leaving school. If I lose her tonight, I won't be able to look Poppy in the face tomorrow morning." Raymond didn't touch her. He had no right to. But when he answered, his voice was low and steady as stone. "You won't lose your grandmother. Not tonight. Not any night." He pulled out his private phone and called Finn Gallagher. The call connected on the first ring, and he gave the order in 20 seconds without a single wasted word. Finn immediately dispatched an unmarked black Chevrolet Suburban SUV from the bureau, along with a veteran female agent named Deidre Callahan, 46 years old, a former elementary school teacher before joining the FBI, a specialist in child witness evacuation situations, driving north from Federal Plaza along Franklin Delano Roosevelt Drive toward Astoria. Raymond turned to Hazel, handed her his phone, and told her to call the principal's office at PS 122 immediately. Give them the parent password from the registration file, and verbally authorize a woman named Deidre Callahan to pick up Poppy at 3:15 that afternoon instead of her grandmother. With the electronic authorization paperwork Finn would send within 6 minutes from a verified email account belonging to New York City Child Protective Services. Hazel did it, her voice trembling but clear word by word. The call ended. Deidre would meet Poppy at the back gate, tell the little girl that Mommy's aunt from the West Coast had flown in unexpectedly and Grandma Maggie had come down with a cold, and that Mommy wanted Auntie to take her on a 2-night camping trip to Auntie's family's little farm near Montauk on Long Island, in a 3-bedroom cabin, with horses and a golden retriever, with Wi-Fi but no television, with Deidre there, with a second female security officer pretending to be Auntie's cousin, and with a 2-man team from Finn keeping watch half a mile away where Poppy would never see them. Poppy would FaceTime her mother at 7 o'clock that evening, and Hazel would talk to her as if it were an ordinary night, as if nothing had happened, because that was the last thing she could still do for her 6-year-old daughter tonight. When the call with the elementary school ended, Hazel looked up at Raymond, and in those green eyes there was now something that hadn't been there the night before, an ancient exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had just signed her child into the hands of a stranger. Raymond pushed the sofa back, dropped down onto one knee in front of her, a movement he hadn't made for any human being except his father's coffin 18 years ago. He looked straight into her eyes without blinking, and he spoke each word the way a man lays brick into a wall he intends to hold up with his own body. Hazel Quinn, look me in the eyes. I will bring your grandmother back, alive, tonight, before midnight. Hazel looked at him, and for the first time in 27 years of life, she believed a man, not because he spoke beautifully, but because in the gray eyes looking at her, she saw herself 18 years earlier, running through the rain to Elmhurst Hospital and arriving 7 minutes too late. At 11 o'clock on Wednesday night, the Hudson Bay wind blew back through the Red Hook docks carrying the smell of diesel mixed with old sea salt, and Raymond Falcone's black Mercedes Maybach came to a stop exactly 20 steps from the iron gate of warehouse number 7 at Red Hook Terminal. He opened the car door, stepped out, raised both hands to shoulder height so the hidden cameras at the gate could see he wasn't carrying anything, then walked inside alone beneath the sickly yellow sodium lights, wearing only a white dress shirt under a charcoal gray wool coat. No tie, no suit jacket, no weapon, not even the gold Zippo engraved with V.F., because he had left it behind in the drawer of his desk at Falcone Tower, like a charm he didn't want to carry into this room. The warehouse door stood open to let him pass. Inside stretched a space 40 meters long and twice as wide, with a 12-meter ceiling. Old shipping crates stacked in 2 rows like twin walls, yellow light dripping down from 4 worn ceiling bulbs, and at the very center, beneath the deepest band of yellow light, stood a wooden chair where Margaret Quinn sat with her hands bound behind her back, the tape already removed from her mouth, her left cheek swollen into the dark color of a ripe plum, and yet her back was still straight in the way only a woman who had spent 30 years in emergency rooms could keep it. 3 steps away from her, leaning against the edge of a rusted red steel container, stood Jasper Wellington with both hands in the pockets of his cashmere coat, the gold ring engraved with the letter W glinting as he tilted his head in greeting to Raymond the way one greets an old family guest. At both ends of the warehouse, 4 men dressed in black stood holding pistols, 2 near the exit toward the harbor, 2 at the entrance. Raymond walked slowly to the center of the warehouse, set the original trap files down on the concrete floor, 4 steps from Jasper, then stepped back twice and spread his hands. Let her go. You take the file, you take your exit, and we end this tonight. Jasper didn't look down at the file. He didn't move to pick it up. He only smiled. And that smile was the first thing in 18 years Raymond had seen on the face of the man he had called Uncle Jasper since he was 19 years old. Do you remember, Raymond, the night of March 11th, 2008, in your father's private office, on the 47th floor? The night federal investigators concluded had been a politically motivated assassination carried out by a rival Italian faction. The night you ran up from the lobby with your coat still half on. The night you held your father's body for 15 minutes before I arrived and placed my hand on your shoulder. I placed my hand on your shoulder that night, Raymond, with the very same hand that less than 2 hours earlier had pulled the trigger of a short-barrel, .38 caliber Smith & Wesson against Vincenzo Falcone's right temple. Raymond stood perfectly still. Not a single muscle in his face moved, not a single finger curled inward, but inside his chest there was something that 18 years of waiting had never prepared him for, a sound moving very slowly, like an ancient wall collapsing inward into itself. Jasper continued, his voice stripped of its mask now, no longer warm and low, but turned into its true shape, a voice higher, harder, 20 years younger than the age he wore on his face. Your father was arrogant, Raymond. He thought he could keep this empire without giving me half after I rebuilt 30 money laundering accounts during the crisis of 2008. I offered him the deal 3 times. He laughed 3 times, and on the 3rd laugh I understood he didn't see me as a brother. He saw me as an accountant. Don Archibald Barlow offered me 1/3 of the Falcone family if I opened the door, and I opened it, and for 18 years I sat at your right hand, ate in your house every Christmas, held you at your mother's funeral in 2013, and every night I watched you play with your father's Zippo. I knew there would come a day when you'd be smart enough to smell me out, and I waited for that day so I could end you before you ended me. Raymond drew in one long breath through his nose. His voice didn't rise even half a note. Uncle Jasper, let the old lady go, and then you and I will talk. Jasper shook his head once. There is no you and me anymore, Raymond. Tonight there's only you, me, and an old woman about to die. He pulled a black pistol from inside his coat, the same .38 caliber Smith & Wesson from 18 years earlier, his thumb snapping off the safety. And at that exact moment, From behind the line of red steel containers to Jasper's right, less than 7 steps away from him, came a woman's voice, clear and calm enough that for one instant Jasper didn't believe what he was hearing. "Mr. Wellington, you missed a detail." Hazel Quinn stepped out of the dark in the same gray Meridian uniform she had worn the night before, unarmed, holding only a phone in her left hand and a sheet of paper folded into quarters in her right. She continued, without looking at Jasper, looking instead at Maggie, and her voice stayed even, word by word. "In the last 3 hours, the FBI has matched your digital signature across 4 shell companies with the hotel surveillance footage from the plaza this morning. Your call to Barlow at 12:03 this afternoon was recorded from a device we planted in the presidential suite 2 months ago. And at this very moment, warehouse number 7 at Red Hook Terminal has been surrounded by a federal tactical unit on all 4 sides within a radius of 300 meters. You thought you were leading Raymond into your trap, but you've stepped into ours." Jasper whipped the gun toward Hazel. Suddenly, the side door of the warehouse burst open with the sound of steel slamming into concrete, and in that quarter of a second, 12 FBI agents in black Kevlar vests, with glowing FBI letters across their backs, poured in a V formation. They were led by Finn Gallagher with a Glock 19 raised in both hands, the command to freeze echoing at once from 4 directions, while tactical floodlights mounted on top of 4 containers flared on in a wash of white, turning the entire warehouse into a stage in broad daylight. The deafening crack of the precision fire momentarily stunned the remaining 2 guards at the entrance, who found themselves pinned by red laser sights before they could even level their weapons. The other 2 gunmen at the entrance raised their hands and surrendered within 2 seconds. Jasper Wellington didn't raise his hands. He spun back toward the chair where Maggie was sitting, took 3 long strides, and dragged the chair and her whole body backward to use her as a human shield, the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson pressed just beneath her right collarbone, his index finger resting on the trigger. "Everybody back. Finn, back off. If anyone takes 1 more step, this old woman dies before I do." Finn stopped 14 steps away, his Glock still raised, but the barrel had shifted slightly 2 degrees to the right, and the agent standing behind him didn't dare fire because the shooting angle was too close to Maggie. Hazel, standing about 4 steps from the red steel container, wasn't looking at Jasper anymore. She was looking only at Maggie, and in Maggie's eyes there was a silent message so clear that only 2 women who had once stood together in an emergency room could read it. Don't come here. Don't do this." Hazel didn't listen. She dropped the phone and the sheet of paper onto the concrete floor and lunged forward in 3 long, uncalculated strides, both hands reaching behind Maggie's back to cut the plastic zip tie with the small knife Deidre Callahan had slipped into the pocket of her gray uniform when she got into the car 2 hours earlier. Jasper swung the gun 50 degrees and fired once at Hazel. The gunshot cracked through the warehouse like a hammer striking hollow metal. The bullet tore through the air and drove into Hazel's right shoulder just beneath the collarbone, and in the instant the force of the impact spun her half around backward, she still managed to clamp onto Maggie's wrist, still managed to rip the broken zip tie free from Maggie's hands, still managed to shove her clear of the chair and behind the container on the right, away from the path of the second shot. Blood began pouring from Hazel's shoulder, soaking through the gray fabric of her uniform. Jasper swung the gun toward Maggie again, and in that exact instant, from behind the row of containers on the left, about 9 steps away from him, came a single shot, fast and clean, not from Finn's weapon. Dwight Hollis, 58 years old, former SWAT captain of the New York Police Department 12 years before moving into the role of chief of security at Falcone Tower, under a cover known only to Raymond, though in truth he had been assigned by the Dawn to watch Hazel since the night before, stepped out of the shadows with a recoil-controlled MCX tactical rifle, and the round he had just fired went straight through Jasper Wellington's right wrist, shattering the bones exactly where his hand met the gun. The Smith & Wesson flew from his grip, skidded across the concrete for 3 meters, and came to rest at Raymond's feet. Jasper dropped to one knee, his left hand clutching his bleeding right wrist, his face drained white, and in those 2 seconds he looked up at Raymond one last time and said nothing, because both men understood that the time for silence had come. Finn and 2 agents moved in, cuffed him with double-locked metal restraints, read him his Miranda rights in the flat, steady voice of a man who had spoken those words more than 1,000 times in his career, and dragged him out through the warehouse door toward the prison transport vehicle waiting outside by the harbor. He would appear in federal court in Lower Manhattan within 48 hours on 8 charges, including premeditated murder, kidnapping, transnational money laundering, and betrayal inside an organized criminal enterprise. And he would never walk out of Florence ADX in Colorado. Raymond turned back to Hazel. She was sitting with her back against the base of the red container, one hand pressed over the wound in her shoulder, her face bloodless, her lips too pale, and her breathing had already begun to slow into the rhythm of a body losing blood faster than it should. He dropped to his knees beside her on the cold concrete, stripped off his charcoal gray wool coat, folded it into quarters, pressed it hard against the bullet wound to stop the bleeding, and placed his other hand behind her neck to keep her head from falling forward. "Hazel, look at me. Look at me, Hazel, look at me." She opened her eyes, looked at him through the haze of pain, and gave him the faintest smile, one corner of her mouth lifting not even halfway. "Sir, my grandmother is home." Maggie crawled out from behind the container where she had been hiding, her knees scraped raw, her wrists red with the marks of the ties, yet she still managed to drag herself forward on her own, gathering her granddaughter's head into her arms, and for the first time in 30 years beside an emergency room, she let her sobs break open across a cold concrete floor, her hands trembling as she stroked Hazel's hair, her mouth whispering, my girl, you're here with me. I'm here. The wail of an ambulance tore through the air from the direction of Van Brunt Avenue. Raymond didn't lift his hand from the wound for even a second. 3 days after the night at Red Hook, Hazel woke in a private room on the 8th floor of the intensive care wing at Mount Sinai on Madison Avenue and 101st Street, with the morning light of October slipping through the gap in the silver-gray curtains and falling across her face. And the first thing her eyes recognized wasn't the ceiling, wasn't the monitor at the head of the bed beeping in a steady rhythm, but Raymond Falcone sitting in the armchair beside her bed, still wearing the same white shirt from the night at Red Hook, washed now but not yet pressed, with 3 days of beard shadow on his face, dark circles beneath his eyes, and Machiavelli's The Prince folded shut on his lap. In the bed beside hers, half hidden behind a curtain drawn only halfway closed, Maggie Quinn was asleep, her wrist wrapped in a thin bandage, a small adhesive strip on her cheek, her breathing even. Hazel couldn't speak right away. Her throat was dry as paper, but she turned her eyes slowly toward Raymond, and he understood. He reached for the cup of water, tipped it gently to her lips through the straw, then set it down again and said very softly, "Your grandmother is all right. Poppy's heart surgery has been scheduled for next Monday. Jasper is being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn while he waits for his first hearing. Everything is over." Hazel gave the smallest nod. She asked, "Where is my daughter?" with a voice that could barely shape the 3 words. Raymond told her Finn was bringing Poppy back from Montauk, and the little girl would be there in about 4 hours, and that all she knew was that her mother had been in a minor car accident in Manhattan while coming home from work. 4 hours later, exactly as Raymond had said, the hospital room door opened a crack, and Poppy stepped in behind Finn Gallagher, her hair still tied in the crooked ponytail Deidre had braided for her that morning, her hands clutching a watercolor painting of a little wooden house beside a brown horse and a golden dog, with the crooked words for Mommy written in the corner. The little girl ran 3 steps to the bed, climbed up with both hands and both knees, and wrapped her arms around Hazel's neck, with all the strength of a 6-year-old child who didn't know her mother had just been shot through the shoulder, who didn't know that the gray-eyed man quietly rising and moving toward the window was the one who had saved her great-grandmother from a warehouse in Brooklyn, and knew only that her mother was breathing, her mother was warm, her mother was here. Raymond turned his face away and looked out the window toward the park below, and a man who hadn't cried in 18 years felt something very old inside his chest shift by a single millimeter. That night, after Finn had taken Poppy to sleep in a hotel near the hospital with Deidre, Hazel asked Raymond to sit beside her bed again, and she used his promise, the promise of one thing of her choosing that she had bargained for in the conference room on the 47th floor that night. "Sir, what I want is for you to leave the world you're living in, step by step, as much as you can, in a reasonable amount of time. But for real, I'm not asking you to do the impossible tomorrow. I'm asking you to begin." Raymond nodded once without needing to think. Over the next 6 months, through a cooperation agreement brokered by Finn Gallagher with the United States Department of Justice, Raymond Falcone turned over the entire black ledger of the Falcone family, along with the connection map of 17 crime families across 3 states, in exchange for the right to convert Falcone Holdings into a newly registered legal investment corporation under the name Falcone Quinn Capital. still headquartered on the 47th floor of the same tower, but with floors 20 through 36 rebuilt into internal audit, compliance, and a charitable foundation named for Vincenzo Falcone that funded tuition support for children from low-income families in Queens. Poppy Quinn underwent a successful heart surgery at Mount Sinai Kravis Children's Hospital, performed by Dr. Martin Levitt on Monday morning in the third week after the night at Red Hook. The surgery lasted 6 hours. She was discharged after 11 days, and 6 months after leaving the hospital, she was able to run 3 full laps around Astoria Park every afternoon with Maggie, without needing to stop for breath. On a Saturday afternoon in April of the following year, Raymond Falcone drove his own black Audi, Q7, without a driver, and parked in front of a red brick building on West 78th Street on the Upper West Side, where Hazel had just moved from the Astoria apartment with the first salary from her new position. He rang the bell, and Poppy opened the door, her hair braided into 2 sides with white ribbons, the solemn round eyes of a 7-year-old child with a new heart. "Are you Mr. Raymond? Mommy said you helped Great-Grandma a long time ago." Raymond knelt to her eye level, took from the inside pocket of his jacket the gold Zippo engraved with the 2 letters V.F. that he had carried with him for 18 years, and placed it into the tiny palm of her hand with both of his hands. "Poppy, this belonged to my father, whose name was Vincenzo. He was a very good man who taught me that you must always check every number in life twice. I've kept it for 18 years, but I've never used it as well as you will. I want it to belong to someone who has known how to check twice since she was 6. Poppy held the lighter in both hands, and it looked too large for her fingers, and she looked up at her mother standing at the kitchen doorway. Hazel stood on the threshold, her eyes wet, and gave the slightest nod. 1 week later, at the far end of the corridor on the 47th floor of Falcone Quinn Capital, through the glass wall separating the office of the Director of Internal Audit from the hallway, Raymond saw Hazel in her smoke-gray suit, standing before a group of 3 young auditors, her hand pointing to a financial table on the screen, and the 2 of them caught each other's eyes through the glass for exactly 3 seconds. And neither of them waved, because neither of them needed to. This story ends here, on the 47th floor of a building that almost became a name erased from the trading board of Wall Street on a Wednesday morning in October, in a city where millions of people pass one another every day, without ever stopping to look into the face of the person pushing the cleaning cart beside them. But if you listen closely enough, this story still wants to leave you with one final thing before it closes. Every empire has its Hazel Quinn. Every company, every hospital, every school, every city council, every family dinner table has someone who sees what no one else sees and spends most of their life weighing whether they should speak or stay silent, because they know the room was never built to hear them. And every empire also has its Raymond Falcone. There is always someone holding the pen, holding the gun, holding the power, carrying a burden on their shoulders while a voice in their head keeps whispering that all the smart people around them have already agreed. So just sign it, just do it. Don't ask any more questions. The truth of tonight's story isn't that one of them became the other's hero. The truth is that both of them had to be brave on the same night, in the same room, in front of the same walnut table. Hazel had to be brave enough to speak when the room wasn't built for her voice. Raymond had to be brave enough to listen when everything in his mind was telling him not to listen. And the lesson the writer wants to leave with you tonight is this. The truth doesn't care where you're standing in the room. The truth doesn't care whether you're wearing a suit that costs $3,000 or a cleaning uniform that costs $30. The truth cares about only one thing: whether there is someone in the room brave enough to speak it, and whether there is someone in the room brave enough to hear it. Dear viewers, if you have ever been the person holding the paper that no one else in the room wanted to look at, if you have ever been the person holding the pen and almost placed your signature on something your heart knew wasn't right, please leave a comment below and tell us your own story. Whether it is short or long, whether it is old or new, we read every line and we listen to every heart. If tonight's story has touched some corner of your soul, please press the like button so that more people have the chance to hear it. Please share this video with someone you believe needs a reminder that their small voice has value. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories we bring to you every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life beside your family and the people you love, peace in every day, restful sleep in every night, and every morning when you wake, the courage to keep checking the numbers in your life twice. Thank you for taking the time to stay with us until the very last minute. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.